really is quite a sight to see. There's a German A7V heavy tank from the First World War. Now, actually, I'm kidding you, it's a replica. It's only built quite recently by Mr. Bob Grundy up at Wigan, but it's the best we can do, best anyone can do, because the only surviving A7V is in Brisbane. No, it doesn't work. So here we have one that does 16 people, which is rather crowded compared with the British tank, which had 8. It's actually running on a fairly modern chassis. Underneath there, it's a county commercial tractor, which has been extended to fulfil the same track bases. That we don't actually have more in the museums around the world that people can see, because technically it's fascinating. But I think this one demonstrates very well how it would only really came back to this country, and it actually spent the first 18 months, 2 years of the war on the East Coast, particularly the sort of East Coast beaches. The only thing we've done to improve it a little bit is it put on a stainless steel exhaust. It was getting through exhaust systems for fun. But apart from that... Used by the British Expeditionary Force in France in 1940. We had 2 battalions of them, 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment battalions, and they fought primarily in eastern France, particularly at Arras. The hatch would be shut. The tracks look woefully exposed. That actually doesn't matter. You'd really have to go over a mine or sustain that sort of damage to break them, and then it wouldn't really matter whether they were covered or not. It doesn't mean it chucks mud everywhere. But it's a tiny little vehicle, and I think the original plan was to build such large numbers of them that you would effectively swamp the battlefield. As it was, we changed our minds about halfway through, and having built a couple of hundred, stopped there, and they were never issued on any large scale, never used again after the fight. The tank following it into the arena also has a rather novel name. This is the famous Valentine. Made its name particularly in the Western Desert from the Battle of Alamein on towards the fighting in Tunisia. The Valentine was produced by what was then Vickers Armstrongs Limited up in Newcastle. It was powered by a GMC diesel engine, which again was eminently reliable. The Valentine, they found it reliable with a reasonable gun. New Zealanders used them in the Pacific, and they had quite an interesting war. There are actually so many different versions of the Valentine with different sizes of gun and different turret crews. Some only had 2 men, some had... Because of that, there was a great turning against them, and the fact that the Sherman was available meant that it took the brunt of the fighting for that 12 months. From June 6, 1944 onwards, and D-Day onwards, British tanks started to improve. We had the Cromwell, with nice fast ideal reconnaissance tank. We had the Churchill, heavily armoured, slow but quite indomitable. And although the main fighting was still done by the Sherman, development was going on. Early in 1945, we brought out a new tank, the Comet. That's what you're looking at there now, the Comet, which proved to be one of our best and most reliable tanks, also rather short-lived. The war in Europe was over by the summer of 1945, and a newer tank was already coming along to replace Comet. But in its day, this was the tank to go tiger hunting in. Got a 77mm high velocity wheels down both sides, which are the main feature of the suspension. You'll see they're quite large. Now, when you see large wheels, it normally means a tank designed for speed. And during the Second World War, this inevitably meant a piston suspension. Christie was an American engineer, a rather trying man to deal with, we are told. The Americans themselves had nothing to do with it. But the British, by a rather long-winded route through Russia, learned about the Christie suspension and introduced it in 19 Christie suspension very well indeed, and they copied it. The ultimate result of their copying was a tank known as the T-34. It first appears in about the middle of the war, mounting a fairly small turret with a 76mm gun. Later on in the war, about 1943 onwards, it's fitted with a larger 3-man turret and a much more... The first thing you'll notice is how incredibly crude it is, both inside and out. And it's built in a very ramshackle way, or at least that's what it would appear to you and I, because the welding looks appalling. The fact is, the Russians didn't care what it looked like. It was a reliable vehicle. It was available to use the Sherman. British Army used huge numbers of them. The reason is that with their manufacturing capacity, the Americans were able to turn out something in the region of 50,000 Sherman tanks during the Second World War. It meant they had enough for everybody. Now, this particular model appeared towards the end of the war. It has a form of suspension which uses rolled flat plated springs. It's powered by two General Motors diesel engines in the back, and it's armed with a 76 in certain areas of the turret which are cast. It runs on metal ribbed tracks. And one thing you'll notice, this is typical of both the American and that stuff at the back. But in this tank, and also of some of the German ones, the engine is in the back, or in this case two engines, behind the turret. This wagon is powered by a Scania six-cylinder engine. It's armed with a 37mm gun in the turret, and alongside the gun it's got twin, as you can see, but quite well armed. In addition to the main armament in the turret, it's got twin machine guns. It's a proper tank, fully turret and so on. Physically involved in the Second World War. Latterly, some of them were sold on to, of all places, the Dominican Republic, although it had really been relegated to a secondary role by then. It's not perhaps got the glamour of the Tigers and the Panthers, but these are the tanks that did a lot of the fighting on the Russian front, and particularly... Panzer, as a word, simply means armour. The full title of a vehicle like that is Panzerkampfwagen. Kampf is war, Wagen is vehicle, so it's an armoured war or fighting. Entered service with the German army in the late 30s. They were used in small numbers during operations in France in 1940, and then became key tanks in the fighting in the West. Quite a considerable influence. There's one quite remarkable thing about these German tanks, and that is their ability to improve. Now, the model you're looking at has kept pace with developments that were going on elsewhere. In fact, I told you that thing was going to fire, it's just stunning. And it kept pace with developments elsewhere, but what they managed to achieve was to do all this without actually tank and a self-propelled gun using the same chassis. The Germans were great exponents of this, although this one's a Panzer III, there were versions on the slightly larger Panzer IV chassis as well. They are now being joined in the arena by the tank which I think is the star of our show, and that is our big Tiger One, turret number 131, which I think more people come to see in this museum than just about anything else we've got, much to my dismay. This particular tank was captured by British forces following an action in Tunisia in 1943. It was fighting against Churchill tanks of the 48th Royal Tank Regiment. It had a couple of glancing blows, leaving us with a complete Tiger tank. The tank was then taken to Tunis, where His Majesty King George listened, and like Schnook at the end of the First World War, it spent a little while on Horse Guards Parade for our people to admire. It was then taken to Chertsey in Surrey, where they took it to bits to try and find out how it was made, and then finally came in here. It's been followed around the arena, by the way, by two German half-tracks, armoured half-tracks, the little 250 recce vehicle and the big 251 armoured. Is perhaps a bit of a novelty. It again is an example of the lengths to which the Germans went to produce quite amazing vehicles. It's a vehicle known as the Kettenkraftwagen. It's almost a half-track motorbike, although really it's a tracked vehicle with a little wheel on the front. They were issued originally to the Luftwaffe parachute units because they were virtually air portable, and they provided them with a lightweight tracked vehicle suitable to pull a car line and to put the thing back together again to send it into action. The gun is an 88mm weapon adapted originally from an anti-aircraft gun, highly accurate, coupled to very good quality optics, something the Germans always had, and it frankly meant